Ethan Keller crouched low in the underbrush, his eyes fixed on the faint paw prints embedded in the mossy soil. The tracks were fresh, too fresh. He adjusted the scanner in his hand, its faint hum swallowed by the dense, alien forest around him. Above, the twin suns of Vauron 7 cast an eerie, fragmented light through the canopy, painting everything in shifting shades of green and gold. He knew he was too deep into Kyrrin territory, but the scientist in him couldn't resist. It wasn't every day you got this close to one of the most feared predators in the galaxy. The Kyrrin were legendary. Standing over 6 feet at the shoulder, with dark blue fur that shimmered like liquid metal and eyes like molten silver, they were as beautiful as they were lethal. Every field guide warned the same thing: Kyrrin are untamable. They don't negotiate, they don't retreat, and they don't forgive. They were the apex predators of Vauron 7, and they had earned that title over millennia of evolving to dominate their harsh environment. Ethan had been following this particular trail for hours, drawn by the unusual patterns of movement. Kyrrin didn't typically linger in one place, let alone circle back on themselves. Whatever this one was doing, it wasn't acting like the others. That alone was worth investigating. His heart pounded as he pushed aside a curtain of foliage, revealing a small clearing ahead. And there it was. The Kyrrin lay sprawled in the center of the clearing, its dark blue fur marred by streaks of crimson. One of its hind legs was twisted at an unnatural angle, and a jagged burn scar ran across its flank, a wound clearly inflicted by one of the base's perimeter drones. Ethan froze, his breath catching in his throat. The creature's ears twitched, and its molten silver eyes snapped toward him. A low, guttural growl rippled through the air. "Easy," Ethan whispered, raising his hands slowly. "I'm not here to hurt you." The Kyrrin bared its teeth, a flash of lethal fangs that could tear through bone like paper. Its growl deepened, but it didn't move. It couldn't. The leg was too damaged. Ethan knew the smart thing to do was back away, leave it to its fate. Injured Kyrrin were even more dangerous than healthy ones, and no one would blame him for playing it safe. But something in the creature's eyes stopped him. There was pain there, yes, but also awareness. It wasn't just reacting on instinct. It was watching him, calculating, trying to decide whether he was a threat or a chance at survival. Ethan slowly crouched, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. "You're not going to make it like this," he said softly, more to himself than the Kyrrin. He unzipped the small medkit strapped to his belt and pulled out a hypo injector filled with a broad-spectrum painkiller. "This is probably a terrible idea," he muttered, inching closer. The Kyrrin's growls turned into a warning snarl, but it didn't lunge. Its eyes tracked him with laser focus as he closed the distance. His free hand extended in what he hoped was a universal gesture of peace. When he was close enough to see the rise and fall of its labored breathing, Ethan paused. He let the Kyrrin get a good look at him, let it smell him, before he reached out to inject the painkiller just above the wound. The moment the needle pierced its skin, the Kyrrin snapped. Its jaws closed around his forearm in a blur of motion, the pressure just shy of bone shattering. Ethan froze, every muscle in his body screaming at him to pull away. "Okay," he said through gritted teeth. "I probably deserved that." For a few terrifying seconds, the Kyrrin held him there, its teeth a deadly vise around his arm, then slowly it released him. Ethan exhaled shakily, his heart hammering against his ribs. He took that as permission to continue. Working as quickly as he could without startling the creature further, Ethan cleaned the wound and applied a regeneration patch to the torn flesh. The burn scar was too extensive for the patch to fully heal, but it would stabilize the tissue and prevent infection. He wrapped the broken leg in a makeshift splint, all the while talking to the Kyrrin in a low, steady voice. He wasn't sure why he did it. Maybe he just needed to keep himself calm. Or maybe he wanted the Kyrrin to know he wasn't just another predator. When the work was done, Ethan slowly backed away, giving the creature space. It watched him with those unnervingly intelligent eyes but didn't move to attack. He took that as a win. "Good luck out here," he murmured, before turning and disappearing back into the forest. Back at the base, Ethan barely had time to step out of the decontamination chamber before Dr. Miriam Reeves was on him. The team leader's sharp, no-nonsense demeanor made her a force to be reckoned with, and the scowl on her face told Ethan he was about to get an earful. "Do you have any idea how reckless that was?" she snapped, her hands on her hips. "You went off-grid in Kyrrin territory, alone, without backup, and now you're telling me you helped one of those things?" "It was injured," Ethan said, keeping his voice calm. "It wasn't a threat." Miriam's eyes narrowed. "They're always a threat, Keller. You know how many researchers we've lost to those things? They don't care if you're trying to help them. They'll rip you apart the second you turn your back." "It wasn't like that," Ethan insisted. "This one, it was different. It let me treat it. And what happens when it shows up at the base looking for its next meal? What happens when the others catch its scent?" Miriam shook her head in frustration. "You've put everyone here at risk." Ethan clenched his jaw, biting back a retort. He knew she was right, at least partially. But he couldn't shake the feeling that the Kyrrin he'd saved wasn't just another predator. There was something more to it, something he couldn't explain. "I'll keep an eye on the area," he said finally. "If it comes near the base, I'll handle it." "You'd better," Miriam said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Because the next time a Kyrrin shows up, I'm not betting on anyone's good intentions. Not even yours." Ethan nodded and headed for his quarters, trying to shake the nagging sense that this was far from over. Something told him he hadn't seen the last of that Kyrrin, and he wasn't entirely sure that was a bad thing. The first time Ethan saw the Kyrrin again, it was just a flicker of movement in the corner of his eye. He had been out near the perimeter of the base, cataloging soil samples, when the sense of being watched prickled at the back of his neck. Turning slowly, he glanced toward the tree line. For a brief moment, he thought he caught the faint shimmer of dark blue fur blending with the shadows, but when he blinked, it was gone. "Paranoia," he muttered to himself, brushing it off. He was already under enough scrutiny from the rest of the team after his run-in with Dr. Reeves. The last thing he needed was to start imagining things. Still, the feeling lingered, a weight pressing against his subconscious even as he forced himself back to work. The following day, the Kyrrin made itself known. Ethan had just stepped out of the research station with a mug of coffee in hand when he spotted it standing at the edge of the clearing. It was the same one. There was no mistaking the burned scar along its flank or the splint, now frayed, on its leg. The creature was still favoring its injured limb, but it didn't look as emaciated as before. Somehow it had managed to survive. Ethan froze, heart pounding as he stared back at the Kyrrin. It didn't snarl or retreat, it just stood there, those haunting silver eyes fixed on him. He felt a chill creep down his spine. How long had it been lingering this close to the base, and why? The commotion started almost immediately. One of the junior researchers spotted it from the observation deck and raised the alarm. Within minutes, the perimeter defenses were activated, the hum of charged plasma fields vibrating in the air. Ethan's stomach twisted at the thought of what would happen if the Kyrrin ventured too close. The drones wouldn't hesitate this time. "Stand down," he shouted, jogging toward the nearest guard post. "It's not attacking," Dr. Reeves appeared out of nowhere, her expression a mix of irritation and disbelief. "What are you doing, Keller?" "That thing's a threat. It hasn't done anything," Ethan insisted, gesturing toward the Kyrrin. "Look at it. It's not even trying to breach the perimeter." "That doesn't mean it won't," she snapped, her voice low but firm. "We've seen this behavior before. They scout, they linger, and then they strike." "You know the protocol." Ethan wanted to argue, but he knew it was pointless. Reeves wasn't wrong, the Kyrrin were notoriously cunning hunters. But this one didn't move like a predator on the prowl. It held itself low, almost wary, as if waiting for something. That night, after the tension had subsided and the Kyrrin had melted back into the forest, Ethan stayed awake, replaying the encounter in his mind. Something about the way it had looked at him felt familiar. He knew it was risky, borderline reckless, but he couldn't shake the urge to reach out to it somehow. The next morning, he started leaving food at the edge of the perimeter. Nothing too conspicuous, just small packets of protein-rich paste and cuts of synthetic meat, carefully selected based on what little was known about the Kyrrin's diet. He had to be cautious, making sure none of the other researchers noticed his little routine. It wasn't exactly against the rules, but it wasn't something Reeves would condone either. For the first few days, nothing happened. The food remained untouched, and Ethan began to wonder if the Kyrrin had moved on. But on the fourth morning, the packets were gone. It became a pattern after that. Each evening, Ethan would leave out fresh food, and by morning, it would have vanished. He never saw the Kyrrin take it, but he started noticing clues, subtle paw prints in the dirt, the faint rustle of leaves in the distance. It was still keeping its distance, but it was there. The breakthrough came 2 weeks later. Ethan was crouched near the perimeter, adjusting one of the environmental monitors when he felt that familiar sensation of being watched. Slowly, he turned his head and saw the Kyrrin, closer than it had ever been. It stood just beyond the edge of the clearing, its head tilted slightly as it observed him. The burn scar had faded to a jagged line of discolored fur, and the splint was long gone, though the leg still looked stiff. Ethan held his breath, his pulse hammering in his ears. The Kyrrin's fur seemed to shimmer more than usual, rippling with faint bands of light that danced across its body like liquid fire. He frowned, realizing this wasn't just a trick of the sunlight. The bioluminescence was shifting, almost as if it were pulsating in time with the creature's breathing. He hadn't read anything about this in the research logs. Was it some kind of camouflage? Or was it communicating something? The Kyrrin took a tentative step forward, then another. Ethan stayed perfectly still, watching as it closed the distance inch by inch. Finally, it stopped a few feet away, its silver eyes locked onto his. He could see the faint rise and fall of its chest, the tension coiled in its muscular frame. Ethan reached into his pack slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements. He pulled out a small pouch of dried fruit, a treat he'd been saving for just this moment, and set it on the ground between them. The Kyrrin's ears twitched, and its bioluminescent patterns shifted again, the bands of light narrowing into sharp, jagged lines. Fear, caution, he couldn't tell, but he stayed still, waiting. After what felt like an eternity, the Kyrrin stepped forward and sniffed the pouch. It pawed at it briefly before tearing it open with surprising dexterity. Ethan watched, fascinated, as it devoured the contents in seconds. When it finished, it looked up at him again, its bioluminescent patterns softening into smooth, flowing waves. "You're not so scary up close, are you?" Ethan murmured, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. The Kyrrin tilted its head, its ears flicking in what almost seemed like curiosity. Ethan felt a surge of triumph and something else, too: connection. This wasn't just an animal, it was something far more complex than anyone had given it credit for. He decided to call it Shadow. The next few days were a whirlwind of discovery. Shadow began showing up more regularly, venturing closer each time. Ethan started keeping a journal, sketching the shifting patterns of its bioluminescence and noting the possible correlations to its mood. Sharp, angular lines seemed to coincide with agitation or fear, while smooth, undulating waves indicated calm or curiosity. He couldn't be certain, but it felt like he was beginning to understand its language. Not everyone shared his enthusiasm. When Dr. Reeves found out about Shadow, her reaction was as predictable as it was explosive. "This is exactly what I warned you about, Keller," she shouted, slamming a folder of reports onto the table. "You've been feeding it, encouraging it to come closer. Do you have any idea how dangerous that is?" "It's not dangerous," Ethan argued, his voice steady but firm. "It's intelligent. It's communicating. It's a predator," Reeves snapped, "and you're putting everyone here at risk with your little experiment. If it attacks someone, that's on you." Ethan clenched his fists, taking a deep breath to steady himself. "I'm not doing this just for me," he said quietly. "My brother." He always believed that every creature could be understood, no matter how dangerous it seemed. He spent his whole life trying to prove that, and I have to believe he was right. Reeves stared at him for a long moment, her expression softening just slightly. But when she spoke again, her tone was firm. "I'll give you one chance to prove this isn't a mistake, but if anything goes wrong, the council will hear about it." "Understood," Ethan nodded, his jaw set with determination. He wasn't going to back down, not now. Shadow was more than just a predator, and he was going to prove it. Ethan wasn't sure when Shadow decided to start following him during his fieldwork, but it was hard to miss the 6-foot predator lurking in the periphery of his vision. At first, Shadow kept its distance, blending into the forest with an eerie ease that made Ethan question if he'd imagined it. But over time, the Kyrrin grew bolder. Shadow would trail him through the dense underbrush, always staying just far enough away to avoid spooking him or the other researchers. Ethan tried to act like it wasn't happening, but the other members of the team began to notice. Todd Mathers, one of the newer recruits, was the first to call it out. "Keller, is it just me, or do you have a stalker?" Todd asked one morning as they set up a weather monitoring station near a rocky outcrop. His eyes darted nervously toward the tree line. Ethan followed Todd's gaze. Sure enough, Shadow's dark silhouette was barely visible between the thick trunks of the alien trees. The Kyrrin was lying low, its silver eyes glinting in the dappled sunlight. Ethan suppressed a smile. "It's not stalking," Ethan said, trying to sound casual. "It's observing," Todd snorted. "Yeah, well, you can call it whatever you want, but if that thing gets any closer, I'm going to need a new pair of pants." Shadow didn't get closer, at least not while Todd was around. But when Ethan ventured out on his own, the Kyrrin's behavior shifted. It wasn't just following him anymore, it was protecting him. The first time it happened, Ethan was hiking along a steep ridge, collecting samples of the fluorescent moss that thrived in the cooler, shaded areas. He was so focused on his work that he didn't notice the predator until it was almost on top of him. The creature, a hulking quadruped with razor-sharp tusks and scales that shimmered like glass, emerged from the underbrush with a guttural growl that made Ethan's blood run cold. He froze, his mind racing as he calculated his options. The perimeter of the base was miles away, and he didn't have a weapon, just a basic stun prod that was no match for something this size. He backed away slowly, heart pounding in his chest. Then Shadow appeared. The Kyrrin moved like a shadow given form, silent and fluid as it stepped between Ethan and the predator. Its bioluminescent patterns flared with sharp, jagged lines that pulsed in rapid succession. The predator hesitated, its growl faltering as it locked eyes with Shadow. For a moment, the two creatures stood perfectly still, a silent battle of wills. Then the predator turned and disappeared into the forest. Ethan stared at Shadow, his chest heaving with adrenaline. The Kyrrin turned its head to look at him, its bioluminescent patterns shifting into smooth, flowing waves. Was it? Checking on him? Thanks, Ethan managed, his voice shaky. Shadow didn't respond, of course, but it lingered for a moment longer before melting back into the forest. Ethan sat down on a nearby rock, trying to process what had just happened. The incident solidified something Ethan had already suspected. Shadow wasn't behaving like a typical Kyrrin. The species was known for its solitary nature, its unwillingness to engage with other creatures unless it was hunting or defending its territory. But Shadow was different. It was interacting with him, responding to his presence in ways that defied the team's understanding of Kyrrin behavior. Ethan began documenting everything. Every instance of Shadow's bioluminescent patterns, every interaction, every behavior that deviated from the norm. He sketched the patterns in his journal, comparing them to the body language he observed. Over time, he began to notice literal patterns that seemed to correspond to specific emotions or intentions. The sharp, angular lines that appeared during the predator encounter, for example, seemed to signify aggression or warning. The smooth, undulating waves were more difficult to interpret, but Ethan suspected they indicated curiosity or calm. There were other patterns, two spirals, zigzags, and bursts of light that radiated outward like ripples in a pond. Each one was unique, and Ethan was convinced they weren't random. "It's a language," he muttered to himself late one night as he pored over his notes. The realization hit him with the force of a tidal wave. If he could decipher the patterns, if he could figure out how Shadow communicated, it could revolutionize the team's understanding of the Kyrrin species and possibly change how humans interacted with them altogether. But not everyone was as enthusiastic about Shadow's presence. Todd, in particular, seemed to take Shadow's proximity as a personal affront. One afternoon, while Ethan was calibrating a set of environmental sensors near the edge of the forest, Todd showed up with a shock weapon slung over his shoulder. "Don't tell me you're still letting that thing follow you around," Todd said, his tone a mix of exasperation and fear. "It's not following me," Ethan said without looking up from his work. "It's coexisting, right?" Todd said, rolling his eyes. "Well, coexistence or not, that thing gives me the creeps. And I'm not going to just sit around and wait for it to snap." Before Ethan could respond, Todd raised the shock weapon and fired a warning shot into the air. The crackling sound echoed through the forest, and Shadow burst out of the underbrush, its bioluminescent patterns flaring with jagged, red-edged lines. It let out a low, rumbling growl that made the hair on the back of Ethan's neck stand on end. "Stop!" Ethan shouted, scrambling to his feet. He stepped between Todd and Shadow, holding out his hands in a placating gesture. "You're just scaring it." "Good," Todd snapped, his knuckles white as he gripped the weapon. "Maybe it'll think twice before coming near us again." Shadow took a step forward, its growl deepening. Ethan could see the tension in its body, the way its claws dug into the soil. This wasn't fear, it was anger. If Todd fired another shot, Ethan wasn't sure he'd be able to stop what happened next. "Shadow," Ethan said, his voice firm but calm. The Kyrrin's ears twitched and its eyes flicked to him. "It's okay, stand down." For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, Shadow's bioluminescent patterns began to shift, the jagged lines softening into smoother waves. It lowered its head, the growl fading into a low rumble that sounded almost reluctant. Ethan exhaled in relief, his heart still racing. "See, it's not attacking. You're the one who escalated." Todd glared at him, his face pale. "You're insane, Keller. You're going to get yourself killed, and when that thing finally turns on you, don't expect me to save your ass." With that, he stormed off, muttering under his breath. Ethan shook his head and turned back to Shadow. The Kyrrin was watching him, its molten silver eyes reflecting the faint light of the setting suns. "Sorry about that," Ethan said softly. Shadow's bioluminescent patterns shifted again, forming a series of spirals that Ethan hadn't seen before. He made a mental note to sketch them later. The incident with Todd didn't go unnoticed. Dr. Reeves called an emergency meeting that evening, her expression as grim as ever. "This has gone far enough," she said, her voice cutting through the murmurs of the team. "Shadow is a liability, and if we don't address it now, someone is going to get hurt." "I disagree," Ethan said, standing up. "Shadow isn't a liability, it's an opportunity. It's showing behaviors we've never seen in a Kyrrin before. It's intelligent, and it's trying to communicate. If we push it away now, we could lose the chance to learn something groundbreaking. And if it attacks," Reeves countered. "What then?" "It won't," Ethan said, his voice steady. "I've spent enough time with it to know that. But if it makes you feel better, I'll take full responsibility for its behavior. If anything happens, you can hold me accountable." Reeves stared at him for a long moment before sighing. "Fine. But this is your last chance, Keller. One incident won and Shadow is gone." "Permanently?" Ethan nodded, his jaw set with determination. He wasn't going to let that happen, not after everything Shadow had done. Ethan was still poring over the most recent sketches of Shadow's bioluminescent patterns when the message came. It started as a sharp, insistent chime from the base intercom, cutting through the quiet hum of his lab. He looked up, annoyed by the interruption, but his irritation quickly evaporated when he saw Dr. Reeves' face appear on the screen. "All personnel to the main hall immediately. This is a priority directive from the Planetary Council," her voice commanded, clipped and tense. Ethan's stomach twisted. Council directives were never good news. When he arrived at the main hall, the atmosphere was palpably different. The usual hum of idle chatter among the researchers was replaced by a heavy silence. Reeves stood at the front, flanked by two council liaisons in dark, authoritative uniforms. Ethan slid into a seat at the back, his mind racing with possibilities. The older of the two liaisons, a man with graying hair and a permanently furrowed brow, stepped forward. His voice was clinical, almost mechanical. "The Planetary Council has reviewed recent reports regarding prolonged Kyrrin proximity to this base, specifically the creature referred to as Shadow. The Council has determined that this represents a potential ecological and safety risk." Ethan felt a lump forming in his throat. He already didn't like where this was going. "Effective immediately," the liaison continued, "a capture operation has been authorized. The Kyrrin in question is to be transported to a secure research facility for in-depth study. This is a controlled effort to better understand their behavior and mitigate potential dangers posed to human operations on Vauron 7. Your cooperation is expected." Murmurs rippled through the room. Ethan's hands clenched into fists. He didn't need anyone to spell out what in-depth study meant. Shadow wouldn't be treated like a sentient creature. It wouldn't be a collaborator, it would be an experiment, subjected to whatever tests the Council deemed necessary. There would be no concern for its well-being, no consideration of the bond they'd formed. His chair scraped against the floor as he stood, the sound cutting through the murmuring voices. "This is a mistake. All eyes turned to him, but Ethan's attention was locked on the liaison. You can't just rip Shadow out of its environment. It's not some dangerous anomaly, it's intelligent. It's communicating with us, with me. If you take it, you'll destroy any chance we have of understanding the Kyrrin species on their own terms. The liaison's expression didn't waver. Your concerns have been noted, Mr. Keller, but this decision is final. The safety of human personnel and the integrity of the ecosystem take precedence over personal relationships. Personal relationships. Ethan's voice rose despite himself. This isn't about me, it's about ethics. About not repeating the same mistakes humanity's made with every species we've ever deemed less than us. Enough, Keller, Reeves cut in sharply. This isn't up for debate. Ethan wanted to argue, to fight, but he knew it would be useless. The council wasn't interested in ethics or understanding. They wanted results, and they didn't care how messy the process got. He sat back down, his mind already racing with plans. If the council wanted Shadow, they'd have to go through him first. The operation began at dawn. A team of 8, armed with tranquilizers and containment gear, set out into the forest, moving with the precision of trained hunters. Ethan wasn't supposed to know the details, but he'd overheard enough to piece together their strategy. They'd track Shadow's movements, corner it, and sedate it before it had a chance to resist. But they didn't know Shadow like he did. They didn't know the trails it preferred, the places it avoided, the subtle shifts in its bioluminescent patterns that revealed its mood. Ethan had spent months earning its trust, and now he was going to use that knowledge to set it free. He waited until the team was deep in the forest before slipping out of the base. His heart pounded as he navigated the familiar paths, every sound amplified by the tension coiling in his chest. He carried nothing but a small pack of essentials, knowing that anything more conspicuous would draw attention. He found Shadow near a shallow stream, its dark fur blending seamlessly with the dappled light filtering through the canopy. It lifted its head as he approached, ears twitching in recognition. Its bioluminescence shifted into slow, deliberate waves, calm but curious. "Hey," Ethan said softly, crouching a few feet away. "We don't have much time, they're coming for you." Shadow tilted its head, silver eyes fixed on him. The patterns on its fur flickered, forming spirals that Ethan had come to associate with confusion. "I know you don't understand," he continued, his voice tight with urgency. "But you have to leave. Go deeper into the forest, somewhere they can't follow. If you stay, they'll take you and they'll hurt you. I can't let that happen." Shadow's patterns shifted again, sharp and erratic. Agitation. It took a step closer, its body tense, as if sensing the gravity of his words. Ethan reached out tentatively, resting a hand against the cool, silky fur of its shoulder. "I don't want to lose you," he said, his voice breaking. "But your survival matters more than anything else. Please, go." For a long moment, Shadow didn't move. Then its bioluminescence softened, forming smooth, flowing waves. Gratitude, maybe. Sorrow. It stepped back, its eyes never leaving his, and then turned toward the dense forest. But before it could disappear, the sharp crack of a branch echoed through the trees. Shadow froze, its ears swiveling toward the sound. A moment later, the armed team emerged, their tranquilizer rifles raised. "Get down, Keller," one of them shouted. Shadow's fur flared with jagged, blinding light, a pattern Ethan hadn't seen before. It let out a deep, guttural growl and lunged not at the team but toward Ethan. For a split second, he thought it was attacking him, but then he realized it was placing itself between him and the rifles. "No, don't shoot," Ethan shouted, raising his hands. "It's protecting me." The team hesitated, their movements uncertain. Shadow snarled, its bioluminescence pulsating in sharp, defensive bursts. It stood its ground, a wall of muscle and light shielding Ethan from harm. "Stand down, Shadow," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Please." The Kyrrin glanced back at him, its silvery eyes filled with something that almost looked like regret. Then, with a final low growl, it turned and bolted into the forest, its powerful limbs carrying it far out of reach. The team gave chase, but Ethan knew they wouldn't catch it. Shadow was too fast, too smart. It would survive. When the team finally returned, empty-handed and frustrated, Ethan felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. Shadow was free, but it was gone. Back at the base, Ethan compiled everything. His journals, his sketches, the recordings of Shadow's bioluminescent patterns, they all painted a picture of a creature far more complex than anyone had imagined. He presented his findings to the team, arguing that the Kyrrin were intelligent, capable of forming bonds and deserving of protection. Dr. Reeves listened in silence, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she simply nodded. "I'll forward this to the council," she said. "They won't like it, but it's the truth." That evening, as the twin suns dipped below the horizon, Ethan stood at the edge of the forest, staring into the shadows. For a moment he thought he saw a faint, familiar glow in the distance, a ripple of bioluminescent light, smooth and flowing. A final goodbye, or maybe a promise.